Well, our lawn chores for our Bermuda grass lawn is really starting to come to an end for the season, but if you have fescue grass, it's really just starting to pick up. And we showed you this lawn earlier in the season with some disease problems, brown patch, and we're going to talk a little bit about renovating and also how to overseed a fescue lawn this time of year. Now, as a reminder, thatch is a problem where the leaf blades don't decompose quick enough, and so they start to accumulate at the soil surface, and it can also be some of the stolons and the waxy part of the grass tissue. Primarily, thatch is a problem more so in Bermuda lawns, hybrid Bermuda lawns that take a lot of high maintenance. It's not quite as often a problem in fescue, although it can be. Now remember, it's usually thatch problems is from overwatering, over-fertilizing, or just mismanagement. But in fescue, it can actually be a result of compaction to the soil, also a low pH, too acidic soil, and then the disease problems like we talked about earlier. This particular lawn, they don't bag the clippings, so it's really not a result of that. Again, it's primarily from the thatch. Now with the lawn like this, normally we mow the fescue lawn in the summer a little bit higher because it's a cool season grass, so it's stressed. And we're mowing it about probably between 3 and 4 inches depending on the season. Now we're going to start cutting it a little bit closer because of the active cool weather and the growing conditions that are just right for fescue. And we're going to cut it even closer though today, about 2 inches, 1.5 inches, because we're going to overseed it. So once we finish mowing it here, you'll see the difference in where it's been mowed. The next step we'll talk to you a little bit later on. Now remember, if your thatch problem is really aggressive, especially with fescue, the time that you would want to correct that problem would be in the fall, which is also the time you can start new fescue lawns or overseed it. Again, most of the time we're familiar with thatch problems on Bermuda, and that is done in early spring, so it's a completely different season that we think about in correcting the problem. Now with the thatch, you need some way that you can actually rake it out, and you can do that by hand. You can use a verticutting machine that will actually cut and throw it up, and then you can rake it off. With Bermuda grass lawn, we have a tendency to even scalp it down a little bit and then catch the clippings and all the thatch that way, but you obviously wouldn't want to do that on fescue because it wouldn't come back for you. So we've cut it just about as close as we want to at this time. Now the compaction problem though we have to correct with another machine, and this has been referred to as a beast. It's one we borrowed from our turf center, and it's actually an aerator. And it's a quite noisy piece of equipment, but you'll see along the front there's some tines that are actually cores, and it pokes down in the ground and it pulls a plug up, and they'll look like this. They're actually more round. These are some that we've stepped on already. But it'll lay those all over the top of the ground. And what I want to show you though on these pieces of core is where the thatch is. You can see right there is a pretty good piece of thatch, about 1/2 inch. Just a little bit there, not too much of a problem. But this is actually helping in the compaction. You're making holes in the ground that will eventually fill in with water, oxygen, and the roots will grow in them real nicely, and you won't even notice it. Now if these cores are too thick on top of the ground, sometimes if it's sandy type soil, you can leave them in there. Otherwise, you want to try to rake those up or compost them some way too. So our next step then is to come in and correct the compaction problem. We're going to do that this time of year with an aerating machine, and Alan's going to help me on this particular project. Well, you can see the aerator does quite a job, but it's also quite a task trying to pull that across the lawn, and it may be one that you would just as soon hire somebody to do, but if you're so inclined, you can usually find these at a lot of the rental places that carry lawn type equipment. Now, if you'll kind of study the cores that have come out of the ground, it really gives you an overview of what's under the ground, and a lot of times it can answer some of your problems. If you'll just look at some of these right here, you can see this particular site, we're pretty fortunate with the sandy loam type soil, but there is a little bit of red clay in there too, and so you can really tell a lot about what's under there. It may be a way to find out if there's a pocket of heavy clay or an area of sand or even maybe some sheetrock or something from a new house. You can find it by studying the soil like this. And if you don't want to go to the trouble or don't even need to do the aeration, you can do the same thing with the sharpshooter shovel, of course, or the soil probe like this that we use to take soil tests with. A lot of times you can just go along and probe the soil and pull out samples a little bit bigger and tell all of the different pockets of soil types that affect drainage and fertilizer applications, all those types of things that might help answer some questions. Now, these again we'll probably just leave on. Again, you can compost them too, but in a real heavy clay soil, I would definitely encourage you to rake them up. But again, nice compost, so that whatever you do, don't bag them up and send them to the landfill. Now, the next step is going to be fertilizing. And we've actually already put the fertilizer on this lawn based on a soil test. Again, it was still somewhat deficient in potassium, which, if you'll remember, is the third number. The middle number is phosphorus, and the first number is nitrogen. And this particular fertilizer happens to be called a lawn winterizer. And I want to talk about this a little bit quickly because it confuses people sometimes. You'll hear that you always need to put a lawn winterizer on in the fall. Well, that's not necessarily true in Oklahoma conditions, especially if you have a Bermuda grass lawn. Remember, sometimes we fertilize too late on Bermuda lawns, and we help encourage the problem of spring dead spot. So if you have a Bermuda lawn and a lot of spring dead spot problems, I would not put any fertilizer applications on this late in the season. I would stop altogether. This blend, though, is perfect for the fescue, though, because now is one of the best times to fertilize fescue. It's actively growing. We'll put another application on probably in November and then again in the springtime. You can even put up as many as 4 applications. But basically a winterizer is nothing more than a pretty substantial amount of nitrogen, low phosphorus, and a high amount of potassium. And potassium helps initiate more root growth, which supposedly will help get you through the winter. But really still match up the fertilizer based on the soil test and what you're deficient in. Otherwise, you're just putting on things you don't need. Now, the nice thing about this one too, if you look under nitrogen, which is the 19%, you'll see down at the bottom here that 4.7 or almost 5% of the 19% nitrogen is coated or slow release nitrogen, and that's even an added benefit because it's going to release over a longer period of time and less problems with water contamination of nitrogen and kind of more of an environmentally type way of applying it. Now, of course, it costs more, but that's something to look for and get a slow release type nitrogen, at least half of it, and we're pretty close there. Well, obviously the next step now is to put on the fescue seed. Now remember, we're overseeding this lawn, so we don't put on as much, usually about 3 to 4 pounds per 1,000 square feet. If you're starting a fescue lawn from scratch and you've put a seed bed in and you're going to start from scratch again, you put on probably 6 to 10 pounds per 1,000 square feet. So you can see we've measured it out. This is about 2 pounds worth of the fescue seed. We're using a blend called Triad, which contains Wrangler, Fine Lawn, and Apache. And a blend is really the way to go because if you get some of these disease problems, maybe some of the cultivars will be a little bit more tolerant. And if you're confused about all of the different types of fescue varieties out there, there's a current report fact sheet, and it's number 6602 that lists all of the fescue varieties that have been tested at OSU and gives you a rating on how they perform in Oklahoma conditions. So again, if you're interested in putting in a fescue lawn or just renovating, now's the time to do it and to get busy, and we'll kind of keep you posted on how this one's coming along.